beautiful Rocky Top, Tennessee. You are listening to the Sherry Voluntary Show, and we are certainly glad that you've decided to spend some time with us. Tonight, Daniel and I had an engagement, so we are in Rocky Top, not our normally Knoxville
at
place,
the
but
Coal Creek Smokehouse
not
Barbecue.
our place together, but
Yeah.
not at my home tonight. So tonight we thought we would talk, since there's been another police shooting of a woman in her home, not bothering anyone. In
she
Dallas.
had her door open. Of course she was
had
bothering
her
people.
door open. She deserved it, y'all.
But just the inside door, not the screen door.
Oh.
So, like,
People,
there was even still a barrier.
Yeah, I don't get that. I grew up, we always left the inside door open and the screen door closed. So, in the summer anyways, for like we had air conditioning sometimes, but a lot of times you just left the screen door closed and the door open, and friends and neighbors would come by and, pop in. I don't know. It's just, that was normal. So anyway, since there's been another shooting of that, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the issues surrounding not that particular, the details of that particular shooting. Tonight, Alan Mosley on the Gold Standard is going to cover in just an hour or so. He's going to go into depth about that particular case. So I really encourage you guys to watch his show and go a deeper dive into the details of that story. But I thought we could talk a little bit about some of the issues surrounding police abuse and some of the things that have come up that I think we have to be careful of when we're talking about these sorts of things. So let's just get into it. One of the issues that I've seen surrounding this particular shooting and the Amber Guyger shooting and the shooting, I shouldn't say shooting, I should say murders, because that's what they are. The murders of these people, hey Christian, of these people who weren't harming anyone, is that they're black and the officers that shot them were white. Of course, not in the case of the witness, Mr. Brown, I think is his name, that was murdered in Dallas, Fort Worth after testifying in the Amber Guyger. They're trying to blame that on drug deal, gone bad, but
it makes sense.
One of the things that I noticed, and there's a certain gentleman that follows my content, and anytime I post anything about cops, especially involving black people, what always comes up is, I'm just surprised that anyone thinks it's unbelievable that a black man would be shot in a drug deal. And I think that's one of the biggest issues with these things, is that people are dismissive of them. And while I don't think that necessarily Amber Guyger shot Mr. Jean because he was black, and I don't think the poor woman who was just shot recently in her home by a white cop, I don't think that she was shot because she was black. I do think race plays an issue.
Yeah, so whether or not race entered into why they got shot, it certainly enters into why they get away with it. Because, cops feel like they can shoot black people with impunity. They don't have to stop and think. Because, so chances are good that they'll get away with it just because of the race card.
Right. And even in those instances, I think that the way that race plays a part is one that I think just evolutionarily people have a natural bias towards people that are more like them, and I don't know what the opposite of bias would be, against those that are not exactly like them. So that plays a deep-seated factor, maybe.
It's still biased. You can have a favorable or an unfavorable bias.
Right, yeah, okay, yeah, so it's bias. So I do think that is a minor issue there, possibly. But then you have all of the systemic racism that has gone on top of that for years and years and years. The idea that black people are going to have guns, that they deal in drugs, that they're violent. Like, you have all those things that come from culture, and people, news reporting, whatever, media, that sort of give people, including police officers, this bias towards, and let's face it, they're most of the time policing the ghettos. They're not in West Knoxville policing where I live. They're policing in the parts of the city where there's not a lot of money, not a lot of people that have.
I mean, there are still 2 cops for every 10 cars driving around West Knoxville. They're just trying to make sure that the people with the bad cars don't stick around. They're just trying to make sure that traffic moves on through and that there's less petty crime and that they can do their speeding tickets. They're just out collecting their revenue and, trying to keep the wealthy people safer.
Right, but nobody's stopping me when I'm walking down the street and asking for my ID and what my business is here. Like, I can walk anywhere in the city of Knoxville and nobody's going to ask me, no cop is going to ask me, why are you here? Unless they're afraid for me in a part of town that is not necessarily safe. They're going to say, why are you here? You shouldn't be here. This isn't a good idea. But I know people who have a different pigmentation who do get stopped and do get harassed and do get asked, what are you doing here? It's none of your goddamn business what they're doing here. That's the point, is that people have a right to be places and ask for their ID and all these different things. So I think that does play a part in these things, but I don't think it's the reason that these people were murdered. I just want to make that clear. I don't think that these white cops busted into these black people's home and said, we're going to murder these people. I don't think it was that. I think they are tragedies and their incompetence, yes, but was racism the motivator? No, I don't think that's the case.
And I don't think they intended to kill anybody in either of those situations.
In these particular cases, now these 2 cases, we're not talking about all the cases where a black person is shot by a white cop.
But that's not it. It's the war zone mentality, the team blue against the world, and everywhere is Fallujah if you happen to be a cop.
Right. Yeah, they fear for their lives. And I did want to bring up a good article. It's by Vox, which often is just puke, right? They have a lot of pukey stuff.
They have a bias, but
they do have a certain bias, but they sometimes hit it on the head so well. And I did want to read a couple things from this article in Vox on it. And it's called Police Can Use Deadly Force If They Merely Perceive a Threat. So you guys can look that up. We can link it in the show notes, possibly, if we put that much work into it today. But so the problem with police shootings, there's 2 problems. And one is that they have to reasonably believe that there's a threat to their life or the lives of another's. And so there was a court decision, Tennessee versus Garner and Graham versus Connor, that they talk about in these. So it says constitutionally, police officers are allowed to shoot under 2 circumstances: to protect their life or the life of another innocent party. What departments call the defense of life standard. The second circumstance is to prevent a suspect from escaping, but only if the officer has probable cause to think the suspect poses a dangerous threat to others. And in this case, Tennessee versus Garner, where they came up with this, it was a case where a pair of police officers shot a 15-year-old boy who was fleeing from a burglary. He stole $10 and a purse, and he lost his life for it. And so the decision, basically what it comes down to is that the job of a cop is to protect people from violence. And if you've got a violent person who's fleeing, you can shoot them to stop their flight. The key to both legal standards, defense of life and fleeing for a violent felony, is that it doesn't matter whether there is an actual threat when the force is used. Instead, what matters is the officer's objectively reasonable belief that there is a threat. There's a problem right there. It's objective. So they get to decide.
Not subjective. It's objective.
Oh, right. Okay. So
that should be that if it were actually ruled that way, that would be a reasonable standard. If you objectively believe that there's a risk, like if there's a credible threat that might happen,
right.
Not that lady is in her living room and therefore she's a threat. That's not objectively
right. But it's every person's, like, the objective standard they gave them is subjective. It's according to what the police officer feels right then. So even though they're calling it an objective standard, like that's how the law is going to judge it. But in the field, the cop, it has a subjective outlook on that.
But they're supposed to apply their training, and the
Right, they're
real
supposed
problem
to,
is
but
that they're not actually trained to look to get out of the violent situation. They're trained to treat it like a war zone.
Right. De-escalation is not a thing that they're taught generally. Not in any major way in most police training. Like there are some areas, precincts, whatever, that have started to try to put in some de-escalation techniques, but that's not generally a thing. But in this case, like a kid, a 15-year-old who could possibly be mistaken for an adult. I mean, I will say that fleeing is not potential violence.
Right.
And I think that's one of the things that cops often are taught or misinterpreted. That we saw a few years ago when we were doing the radio show, we covered the stories where the man was running from the cops and was murdered. And they're just running. They're not waving a gun wildly or any of that stuff. They're just running away. Christian Garrett Moore says just because it's normal doesn't mean it's right. That's true. And that's the problem. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that because I think the race aspect, while there are race issues that need to be addressed in these two particular things, I think it's important for people like us to, when we speak about these things, not just dismiss it as a racially motivated shooting, because that's oversimplifying it for one, and I don't think it's the proper way to treat the matter, because we don't want to call racism what isn't really racism, even though there may be racial issues involved.
Right.
Does that make sense? So I think that's important.
The issue in play is not really racism, it's police and their tendency to abuse the law.
Yes, and for the law not to apply to them. And we have qualified immunity. So police basically, and not only are they state agents, and if they are ever make it to court on something that they've done wrong, they're in a state court. So they're state agents in a state court being protected by the state prosecutors or defense attorneys. So I think those are all issues that really go at play in these things. And in the most recent case of the woman in Texas, they've already arrested the cop for murder. But what's going to happen is in pretrial, he'll probably be brought down to something lower. But at least they're calling it that right now, which is good. That's a good step. And I think they have to, because so many people are pissed right now about what's going on, and they should be. But I don't want these things to be dismissed. And what I really wanted to talk about too in regards to this is that, you know, people like us who are aware, very aware of police misconduct, police brutality, police just corruption in general, often, you know, my friend Patrick Smith made a post yesterday about this on his channel, Disenthrall, on Facebook, and he was talking about how it can be really just crazy making this stuff, and it can really make you depressed because we're covering it all the time. And I think part of it is that when you're aware of the kind of corruption and brutality that goes on, you feel obligated to cover it and to press it, because so many people will just dismiss this as, if they love cops, they'll just dismiss it as, oh, this is just the media going after cops. And if they hate cops, they'll just dismiss this as just they'll just chalk it up to one more black person being murdered by cops, which, I mean, it is, but those are both oversimplifications. And I think people really need to look at what the issues are. And so,
but yeah, one of the things I feel like it's important to do is once you see, you can't unsee all of these stories. And so rather than let people dismiss it as that it doesn't happen that often, or it only happens in some areas, or you've got to point out when it's local, you've got to point out when it's egregious, you've got to point out if there's any, like, sure, there are lots of stories that aren't worth pointing out because they're just another typical story. But even if you ignore the typical stories and just go after the egregious ones, the local ones, the sheriff shooting the guy for fleeing at 10 miles an hour in his pickup truck while towing a trailer, so they execute him.
Right.
Or
Because they don't want their cars to
Yeah.
be damaged.
Or a similar story, but local, is the cop in Oak Ridge who shot a guy for fleeing when they just didn't properly pin him in. Like, they didn't block his car off, and so he was going to drive off, so
Right.
they just
It was
killed
their
him.
own incompetence, so they just murder. I mean, when you give people the power of violence, they tend to use violence. Like, that's the problem with this kind of power. Power corrupts. When you give people power, they're going to use it. And the tendency, when you have all the state apparatus backing them up, that where they can get off with raping children and women and murdering people, is that they're going to continue to do those things and back each other up. So we know all those issues, but I really want to talk a little bit before we go about how we do this, how you talk about these things without it making you crazy. And I think one of the things that I've learned that I have to do, and that is just my perspective has changed over the past 2 years of doing this kind of stuff, is that it's not my responsibility to inform everyone in the world about this. That's what I do. It's, I have this show and I want to talk about things, but I don't have to continue to cover this constantly. And sometimes I have to pull back. That's why I'm not covering the issue with the woman who was just recently shot, because I've seen the footage. It's terrible, and it makes me enraged. Like, I get enraged about these things, and for my own sanity, I have to pull back. Otherwise, I'm not doing the other parts of my life very well that I need to do, like being a mom. So I think that's a really important thing for us to realize, is that when we know sometimes about this stuff, we feel responsible. We feel obligated to inform the world, because so much of the world is just dismissive of bad behavior from cops. And so I just want you to know that we are all doing this together. We can lighten each other's load by sharing the things that we can share and pulling back when you need to. Because the last thing we need is more people just burning out completely, or seeing the world as such a terrible place. Look, the world is not a terrible, terrible place. And for some people, it is worse than others. We're not going to mince words about that. But as just individuals, there's only so much that we can do, and you have to remember that. You have to respect that you have limited capacity, and if things are they're affecting your mental health or your well-being, then you need to do what's good for you first and pull back from that. There's always another fight. Look, this isn't going away right now.
Yeah.
So we're going to have to deal with this for the time being.
Yeah.
To come.
The other thing is don't burn out, but don't burn up. Don't kill yourself, and don't let this escalate. Don't let it spin out of control in your head to where you feel like things are worse than they are,
Right.
and that it's time for violence, because violence is not the answer right now.
Yeah.
The worst thing that could possibly happen is that you start a revolution, but you're by yourself.
And you're just murdered.
You're not-
We're just covering your story on the local news.
Yeah.
Like, that's what I don't want for you guys. And I think that's a great way to put it. Don't burn out, but don't burn up too. Because you don't want to start feeling like everywhere you go, you're in danger. Because you're not. For the most part, most people aren't. And look, if we want to change things, we're going to have to reach people who love cops. And I've done it. I know y'all have heard it. I yell and scream about the cops. I say things that to you guys that I might not say to the person on the street I'm talking to that is supportive of the cops. We have to come in at a different approach. And so we need to make sure that we practice the language of level-headedness so that we can reach the people we really need to reach, because it's not you that I need to let know that cops are bastard authoritarians. Like,
don't scream
y'all know
about
that.
how bad cops are at your homeschool co-op.
Right, right. You need to reach those people. And look, there's enough out there. We just have to point them in the right direction and sort of help them along. And remember that it's not, we don't have to ruin all the relationships in our lives because people are wrong. Like, it's okay for people to be wrong. We're working on that. There are a lot of us out there working on it. You're working on it. I'm working on it. it's going to take its course, and the tide will turn, and where we have opportunity, let's take it. But we don't have to force it and ruin every relationship in our lives. I don't want you to be the person that everybody goes, oh God, here comes so-and-so. Here comes Christian. He's going to start yelling about cops. And like, I don't want that for you. Your life is not made better by that. So people can know what you're about without hating seeing you darken their door.
Have the conversations. Just, be reasonable about them.
Yeah. Even though cops aren't reasonable, and we know you know that. So
yeah. But yeah, and don't go into any encounter with a cop with the expectation that you're going to get shot, because then your response record every encounter with a cop, but don't escalate them.
Yeah. Yeah. Your job is to live to fight another day, to keep exposing this stuff. There are not enough of us out there, guys, for y'all to be martyring yourselves. So, and that's a much better way to get to people, is to understand that even though they're cops, they are human.
Yep.
I know y'all might be surprised to hear me say that, and that there may be a way to reach them too. I interviewed Rayford Davis, who is a voluntarist who used to be a cop. They can change as well. We have to start changing our outlook on how we're going to reach out to these people, because we need to reach their humanity as well. And hopefully the more of them there are that turn around, just like we see with veterans. So many veterans who are anarchists or libertarians are making huge strides within that community, because they'll listen to them because they used to be there. And it's the same with cops. We need more cops, former cops, to come out of it and talk about it. So
yep.
With that said, take care.
And take opportunities to meet with other voluntarists.
Yeah, that's what we're doing tonight.
Yep. If you have an opportunity to drive across the state, grab barbecue in Rocky Top with someone from out of state, you should do it.
We didn't drive across state. We drove for half an hour. That's not across state.
Yeah.
Like across state is like Memphis.
Don't minimize this. We
I'm
came
just
all
saying.
the way from we came all the way from Farragut to Rocky Top.
Okay.
Anyway.
All right, you guys. Peace.
Good night, folks.